According to the Canadian Prime Minister, now recently we interviewed regarding this ongoing political and also this economic competition between US and Canada. And this is what the Canadian Prime Minister has said, and I quote, "Countries that rushed into dodgy deals with the US under President Trump got deals not worth the paper they were written on." And then he went on to say that we ditched the stable EU single market for the fantasy of the brilliant US trade deal and ended up with higher costs, bureaucracy, and now Trump tariffs, end quote. By looking at this complication of the geopolitics, and of course today the question we need to ask is what about this relationship between US and some of the close allies? But in addition to what's happening outside the US, and also we need to understand internally, and there's another critical factor that really drives the politics move forward, especially when we look at 2026, which is religion. And we know that today, by survey, that more and more young people today are starting to questioning the purpose of religion, and especially the Christianity in this country. And how do we understand that? And of course, the more experts start to point it out that under President Trump, that the word religion or the meaning of Christianity has been distorted in a way that it's hardly recognized. Is that so? And what about the democracy? And what about this close ties between religion and democracy today? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who's Dr. Matthew Bodie. And Dr. Bodie has written for many publications and authored 3 books. He's appeared on CNN, MSNBC, and the New York Times. And he's the author of this amazing book, which is called The 7 Mountains, Mandate Exposing the Dangerous Plan to Christianize America and Destroy Democracy. Well, Dr. Bodie, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Happy to be here.
Well, again, Dr. Bodie, such a fascinating book. And of course, today, as I mentioned before, when we look at the complication of the geopolitics, it's not just about this cultural and this economic agenda, but internally speaking, we need to look at our country and also really to understand the role of religion. So I do want to get started because, again, as I mentioned before, as I start to pace myself to read through your book, this is something that you wrote, and especially regarding one of the, what we say, the strong advocate for the Christian groups is the turning point. Again, in this book, this is what you wrote, and I quote, "Now it means the policy and laws that keep the God of evangelicalism and the rulers, not merely of our politics, but all other cultural, economic, and business arenas. Through millions of dollars and by the power of the millions of followers, Turning Point has the nation standing on the precipice of the destruction of our democracy." End quote. Dr. Bodie, from your perspective, again, let's talk about this a little bit. Why do you think, fundamentally speaking, that organizations such as Turning Point has drawn millions of fans, or we called it, or followers across the nation? And how do you think that the meaning or the purpose of Turning Point has actually changed the meaning of Christianity today? Your thoughts?
So Turning Point's been around for, more than a decade now. And I think that it's been successful, really with college students and now high school students because of the way in which Charlie Kirk has interacted with the public through the campus debates that he does, through the intimate nature in which these debates happen, through any social media interactions that Turning Point has done. But in terms of your second question, the reason it's been successful recently in recent years, it's turned itself into a Christian nationalism organization. Before it was not that; it was merely a conservative social policy organization. But in turning itself into a Christian nationalism organization, it was able to spread its demographics beyond high school and college. If you think Turning Point is just for a youth movement, that is not the case at all. Many of its events are attended by people of all ages, but also it tapped into a audience, a message, a demographic that's been around for a while. Conservative Christians involved in politics been around for a while. But what Turning Point has made that long-term agenda is really hyped up by, again, the power of Charlie Kirk and also the power now of Turning Point, the brand. It's involved in so many areas of our culture. It's been successful in so many areas of our culture. It is really a juggernaut. It's a kingmaker. Charlie Kirk was a kingmaker before he was, of course, tragically assassinated in September. And I think that what makes Turning Point successful right now is obviously that the martyrdom, the legacy of Charlie Kirk, but also the idea that they are trying to change something bigger than politics. They talk about a movement. They talk about restoring the spiritual nature of America. Talk about restoring America to its origins as a Christian nation, which aren't true. So I think it's speaking to a lot of different people in a lot of different ways, and of course raising lots of money to do that.
Well, Dr. Bodie, again, what we say when we talk about the role of Christianity and we talk about the role of religion, I would say that, again, not only from my generation, but let's look at the history from the older generations. I want to bring another person into our conversation, and I'm sure that you're very much familiar with the person, and the name is Pat Robertson. And I know that, I mean, again, look at in the early 80s, and, we look at the life and legacy, someone like Pat Robertson, he started this Christian movement. And of course, that his ambition was also driven by the political reason. But we look at comparison and contrast. Back in the days, correct me if I'm wrong, when we look at someone like Pat Robertson, someone like Billy Graham, and the reason was very simple, was to really call to action. So in other words, to Christianize the nation, we try to separate, or they try to separate the politics from the religion. It's really about the purity of the spirit or the purity of the actions. But today, when we look at Turning Point organization, where we look at more Christian groups, it's no longer a separation of religion and politics. It's more about political games. It's more about favoring the political figures. So Dr. Bodie, again, based on your research and your understanding, what has happened over the decades? Why today people, when we talk about Christianity, when we talk about religion, or even talk about the spirit walk in our country, things are way more complicated, and also it's causing more controversies than ever. No, it doesn't matter, we talk about Pat Robertson, or we talk about Billy Graham or not. People no longer, again, I want to be careful, not actively buying into the rhetoric or the narratives of the religion today, but instead people are saying, oh, I'm going to walk away from this because this is not what I'm looking for. It's become too political at this moment. Your thoughts?
So I think Pat Robertson is a good example. So you think about what Pat Robertson did. Obviously, he was a minister, evangelist. He started a huge media company and then also ran for president. So in terms of the 7 mountains of our culture, he took after 3 of them. And I think what you point out is this kind of separation, perhaps early on, of religion and politics. He tried to get into the political realm by bringing his religion into it, and still they tried to activate conservative Christian voters to vote their conscience. But there was a separation there. But I think what has happened, what makes the difference between the era of Pat Robertson and the era of Charlie Kirk, of course, is that Charlie Kirk has made that separation non-existent. But not so much married religion and politics, even though that is the case. I think what they did was they expanded the market for this marriage of religion and politics to culture. So it wasn't so much trying, in one way, Pat Robertson, to make America a Christian nation through a minority, very minority. Pat Robertson was a minority in the Christian faith. And so to constantly battle that minority position, what Charlie Kirk and Turning Point and the new generation of Christian nationalists is the idea that the culture, if we expand our message beyond religion and politics to culture, we can gain more followers. So a Christian culture can get, obviously, lots of Protestants, lots of Catholics into it, but also can get kind of the, Easter Christians or Christmas Christians, or people who consider themselves Christians but don't really attend church, but who are, of course, part of the Trump coalition called MAGA. So expanding the idea of culture and a Christian culture. And this comes specifically, I think, from Breitbart, the alt-right, whatever you want to call it, site that has now taken over in so many ways the Republican Party. Charlie Kirk got his start on Breitbart. Andrew Breitbart's famous phrase was that politics is downstream from culture. So culture was the battlefield. And this is where I think that Charlie Kirk made his mark by expanding in all 7 of the areas. Pat Robertson only did 3, if you want to say that. Charlie Kirk and Turning Point are doing all 7. So they're really attacking culture beyond, obviously, politics is one of the mountains. But what makes Turning Point successful is its wide reach.
Dr. Bodie, it's rather fascinating that, again, we look at different generations and we look at different leaders when we come to Christianity. But again, I want to go back to the question I asked before. I have to say that not the second term, but that we look at the first term of Donald Trump. And correct me if I'm wrong, there was another crucial buzzword that came out, or even right around the corner, that Trump declared his interest in running for the presidency. It was called Christian nationalism. I think before that, there was a clear cut, or there was a clear line between being a Christian and being a nationalist. But as soon as Donald Trump appeared on the stage, randomly, or should we say purposefully, I guess, from this political strategy perspective, people start to see the word Christian nationalism. And it led to a huge debate. First of all, back in the days, during the first term, it was rather difficult to define Christian nationalism. Right. How would people understand that? And why it was rather controversial for people to follow Trump and also to buy into this idea. But fast forward, again, looking at Charlie Kirk, looking at Turning Point USA, looking at, any other religious groups around Trump at this moment, people seem to get comfortable with Christian nationalism or being called Christian nationalist. But again, Dr. Bodie, excuse my ignorance about this. When people ask me to define Christian nationalism, especially when we look at the complication of the politics in America today, I'm sorry to say that I have to be so apologetic to admit that I don't know. I don't know how to define Christian nationalism. Right. And why do you think that Trump's voters today, regardless the reasons or purposes, are still also facing a difficulty in defining this term? So again, Dr. Bodie, you're the expert. How should we define that? And why do you think today the line of the definition or the line of interpretation, it's even get more blurry than ever? Your thoughts?
Well, I think that, one, let's admit Christian nationalism is an academic term made up by academics who study this kind of small subset of Christianity, this evangelical, charismatic, 7 Mountains mandate, a group of people that were the original spiritual advisors for Trump's first evangelical advisory board. And within that group, there are several tenets that have different spectrums of beliefs. One is America was founded as a Christian nation. Do you believe that? Or is there a range of what you think about that? 2, should we return to that? And 3, should there be a crossing of line of violence or authoritarian approach to government to restore America a Christian nation? And those are really 3 basic definitions of Christian nationalism. And of course, it's not just a yes or no question. There could be a range of I'm kind of into it, I'm kind of not. And this is what sociological research does. But I also think that my subtitle of the book kind of concisely defines it, is they want to Christianize America through the culture. This does not mean that they want to persuade the majority of people to become Christians. The 7 Mountains Mandate is a minority movement on purpose. They see themselves as the pure Christians, the holy Christians, the Christians that are meant to take power back from the anti-Christian forces that control our culture. There are 2 ways to do that. One sort of a culture power grab. And the key person to that, of course, is Donald Trump. So in his first term, you had many of the people involved in 7 Mountains Mandate talk about Trump as this divine figure put into power at a particular moment to start reclaiming the culture for Christ. Now, when he lost the 2020 election and the insurrection happened, the insurrection was a Christian nationalism fed day. It was a talk about God keeping Trump in office, God punishing the people that stole the election. Of course, that did not happen. And once he comes back into office, it is all more the power of Donald Trump. So you think about, I think, Charlie Kirk's a good example of the Christians who, let's say, struggled with Donald Trump. Charlie Kirk did not support Donald Trump for the first few months of the primary back in 2016. Once he became the candidate, he quickly jumped onto that train. But there are many Christians out there, I think, that even they are anti-abortion or pro-life more widely or other issues, had personal misgivings about supporting Trump, but he gave them certain number of policies and certain number of justices that they came around it. But it has always been that group of charismatic, that spiritual advisory board who have mega churches around the nation, that their supporters have fundamentally followed him. There's a 30% group of people that are never going to give up on President Trump, and many of them are white evangelicals. And I think that no matter what he does, whether it is populism, which is sometimes anti-Christian to them, whether it is starting foreign wars that they didn't like, but he has always been this kind of authoritarian approach to government. Now he's just allowed to do it more. So he is combining the Christian followers and the Christian supporters and dragging them along into his nationalism. Christian nationalism is a term to Christianize our culture, but that's been around long before Donald Trump. And they saw Donald Trump and say, he can be our king. He can be our political savior. He can be our biblical figure here.
Dr. Bodie, let's going back to your book. Again, as I prepare for our interview and I look through the documents, especially look at some of the founding documents, nowhere that I can find the word violence. So in other words, that in our nation and also in protecting the democracy of a country, that we know that regardless what background, what nationality and the color of the skins, the violence has never been the solution to any problem, period. So, but in your book, that it seems like there's been a good amount of people, especially when they call themselves the Christians, they believe that, and I quote, violence in order to save our country or to ensure that the rightful leader takes office. And more than 80% agree that the final battle between good and evil, it's upon us. It terrifies me, Dr. Bowen.
Oh, yeah.
It scared me because when we talk about, again, I'm not saying that I'm perfect. I know my life is not perfect. We all have our problem to deal with.
Right.
But the thing is, the moment I remember the day that I set my foot in church, I travel and I talk to people. And again, I visit different churches, talk to evangelical leaders across the nation. But not once that I heard that the only solution to purify our nation or the only solution to purify our spiritual walk is by creating violence. But today we're seeing the so-called Christians are doing the opposite. So in other words, in order to distinguish the good and the bad is by looking at the violence, is by looking at the behavior, is by looking at the aggressiveness that we bring upon other people. Dr. Bodie, again, in your book, based on your research, why are we turning ourselves into this today? So in other words, how should we understand that violence seemed to be one of the most effective method or channels to make the messages louder and clearer in order to so-called Christianize, purify the country? Your thoughts?
I do think one of the things that pushes the violence and at least the aggressiveness with the Seven Mountains Mandate is its idea that they're after institutions and not just individuals. Again, you mentioned individual faith and the way in which we perhaps can battle individual things. They want to raise the stakes of the spiritual battle within the individual to the institution. And so that, of course, means culture. So the more that they see they're losing their culture, the more that they see they're losing their institutions, the more that they see they have to raise the stakes of their response. And so, yes, the insurrection was a Christian nationalism day. But since then, of course, we've seen many more acts of violence, rhetorical aggressiveness. And I think that the more you raise the stakes, good versus evil, you can't go any higher or lower than that. And the more that you suggest that losing is against God's plan, losing in a democratic election is against God's plan, or the more you suggest that it isn't just individual people that are powerful in our countries, it's these demonic forces. Again, one of the heartbeats of the Seven Mountains Mandate is spiritual warfare. They've taken the individual verses in the Bible about covering yourself with a breastplate of righteousness and using the sword of the Spirit. They've taken those individual applications and made it national. So back to the violence. I think, of course, there's political violence on all sides, not just the two sides that we have here. But we also need, especially with the Seven Mountains Mandate, there are several people that are not into violence. But the more that they stay silent about the insurrection and about Donald Trump, the more that they give it permission to continue. And I just want to mention, though, the events of the last week and a half, the shooting at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. That person, from what we learned so far, was raised in a very conservative theological church, and in his letter apparently tried to answer objections that Christians would normally have to getting involved in politics and getting involved in violence. So there's a way in which we can read political violence as the raising of the stakes around us. We have to act now, and that's what this guy was suggesting had to happen. He could not take it anymore.
Dr. Bodie, I have two more questions before letting you go. Now, again, I want to move on to next topic. In your book, not only that you talk about, the history of Christian, in our nation, but also you brought a lot of figures really to our mind. And for example, former U.S. President Jimmy Carter, and you mentioned former U.S. President Ronald Reagan. Of course, we know that Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. and along with Billy Graham, we talk about Pat Robertson and also Bill Bright. When we look at all those people, if we put ourselves in this religious sense, or if we borrow the phrase from this religious perspective, is God put the right people at the right time. They all appeared in history according to purposes and reasons and values. There's no doubt that all the names that we mentioned, that they contributed so much, not only to this political development, but also to the religion, cultural, economic progress. But we look at today, again, Dr. Bodie, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like the religious groups are running a political agenda, directly or indirectly. There's something we can see on the paper, but something that we cannot see. We have to really dig deeper on this. So Dr. Bodie, from your perspective, again, going back to your book, one thing that, again, just based on the title of the book, that stuck with me is about democracy. So do you believe that today, when we look at those religious organizations or religious groups, they are intentionally trying to bring political voices into their religious institution or religious growth, but meanwhile, it's really conflicting with our democracy? What do you say to that?
So if I think of democracy as the many different voices and parties and stakeholders getting together to debate and compromising when they disagree, that is the heart of American history. That is not allowed in a Christian nationalism setup because they've raised the stakes so high, as I mentioned before. In the Seven Mountains Mandate, it is about retaking the culture from people, not just that you disagree with or that is setting the country on the wrong path, but from demonic forces. So you mention all those people on both sides of the political spectrum are trying to influence our society. And that was, I think, the original goal of something like Bill Bright, is to influence with his large Campus Crusade alumni, to influence different cultures. But it got turned and added spiritual warfare so that now it becomes a spiritual battle against demonic forces. So in a democracy, you can't have the lack of compromise. You can't have the lack of statesmen or leaders who are willing to represent all people, not just their own base. In democracy, you need to work with the other side, and that has not been happening for quite a while. So when I say that the Seven Mountains Mandate and Christian nationalism is a threat to democracy, one, they're a minority movement on purpose. So they're trying to install their own power over the majority. That's anti-democratic. And then two, I think the idea to them of a Christian culture means that there are select people at top of these mountains who can empower to enforce this culture over the rest of us. That's also anti-democratic. But really the last part is that we live in a country now that is not irreligious. There's plenty of religious people out there, but is a religious pluralistic society that religions are allowed to exist. And I just want to end about, the idea of the First Amendment, the separation of church and state, which is, not in that verse, in that amendment, but that's the idea. The Seven Mountains Mandate would say that America is a Christian nation by culture. So it really doesn't matter if the government per se has called itself to be a Christian government. If the rest of the culture is Christian, it's going to go along with it. Trump's cabinet agencies have been posting Bible verses after Bible verses on their official social media accounts in the Department of X or the Department of Y, because they want to promote this idea that we're all in a Christian culture. So they're kind of just, sidestepping the First Amendment. They also say, of course, that states do not have to follow the First Amendment. They can be Christian government. So you can see the ways in which, the slow movement toward what Charlie Kirk says, we live in a republic. We don't live in a democracy, because he didn't want to be ruled by the majority. In a republic, according to him, there's values and morals and a history and a culture that you have to enforce.
Well, again, Dr. Bodie, I want to wrap up our conversation by asking you the last question. Again, the book is called The Seven Mountains Mandate, Exposing the Dangerous Plan to Christianize America and Destroy Democracy. Dr. Bodie, let's just say, for most of us who aren't familiar with the history of religion in our country, and also, of course, the ongoing political and also religious movement in our country, by reading your book, what do you expect the readers to understand? So in other words, when we finish reading the last chapter of this book, what are you hoping that the readers to appreciate and hopefully and can be enlightened by the critical content and the research that you put in your book? Your final thoughts.
Yeah, see, I don't know if I would use the word enlightened in the sense that many readers have told me that after reading the book, they're really scared, really sad, that the light, yes, they've learned a lot of things, but they've also learned about a movement that's been going on for 50 years, been going on under the radar, on the fringes, or unknown to them. And really, once they discover that it is happening, and also they discover that even in the majority, it's hard to stop, you have to wonder now, what are the political and social and cultural forces at play that an individual reader says, wow, this is really beyond me. And I think that the book kind of sets that larger context, that larger history, but also the group of Turning Point USA. You may not have heard of them or heard Charlie Kirk before he was assassinated, but they are influencing high school and college students around the nation. They are raising money and knocking on doors for candidates. They are doing all the things and all the institutions to change America.
Well, again, Dr. Bodie, such a fascinating book. I have to admit, as I mentioned before taping the show, it's a wonderful read. It's terrifying. It's terrifying to look at what's happening right now, and it's even concerning and scary just to understand not the deeper level, but the surface level of this movement, again, across the nation. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's such an honor to speak to Dr. Matthew Bodie. Again, Dr. Bodie has written for many publications and authored various books, and he's the author of this amazing book, which is called The Seven Mountains Mandate, Exposing the Dangerous Plan to Christianize America and Destroy Democracy. Well, Dr. Bodie, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure, and we'd love to have you back on the show as we continue to pay closer attention to our domestic affairs. So thank you so much for your time.